Right, okay. Thanks for the introduction. This is the title I dreamed up for this evening's presentation. Vulnerability in Emergencies, Adopting a More Holistic Approach. I plan to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then invite questions, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. However, if you feel the need to intervene before then, please feel free to do so. Happy to take any questions or comments or challenges as we go through. The germ of the idea for this presentation this evening arose out of some critical personal feedback I received. I just organised a seminar at the Emergency Planning College on identifying and meeting the needs of vulnerable adults in emergencies back in, I think it was November of last year. Did anyone by any chance attend that? Oh, right. Okay. Right, so I've got to be truthful and accurate then about that seminar. Okay, I was hoping to have a clean run, but okay. Anyway, so I thought this seminar, it's a 2-day seminar, 60 or 70 people, including your good self, had come along and lapped it up, I thought, until I read the feedback. Obviously, at the end of any course or seminar run by the Emergency Planning College, we distribute evaluation forms and we say to people, we're really interested in what you've got to say and we'll listen to what you've got to say. But when I read this, I wasn't quite so interested in what this person had got to say, because she said, it was all right. The seminar was all right. I spent 6 months planning it, by the way. The seminar was all right, but it was a bit too focused on old age. Oh, right, I thought. Well, old age, you know, is not a bad indicator of vulnerability. But actually it was a good piece of feedback, because we probably had focused a little bit too much on old age, because vulnerability in emergencies is incredibly wide, because anyone can be vulnerable in an emergency. So that got my mind thinking about other ways of looking at vulnerability in emergencies, and that's what triggered the thinking behind tonight's event. So this is what I'm going to try and do over the next 30 minutes or so. Clearly there's a need to identify those who may be vulnerable in an emergency insofar as it's possible, because it is mission impossible, isn't it, for Category 1 responders, Category 2 responders working together with other key players in emergency management to be able to identify all who are vulnerable. I was delivering a course in the City of Westminster Council area on Monday, and on their patch they've got the House of Commons and lots of iconic places, and their resident population is about 230,000, but on a daily basis they get over 1 million people in the area, working, visiting, tourists, etc. So how could they possibly have any chance of knowing, you know, everyone who is potentially vulnerable in an emergency on any given day? So it is a challenge, but it is something we need to try and do, because we have got finite resources, and we need to make sure that we use our resources as well as possible to identify and assist those people who are less able to assist themselves in an emergency. So old age, as I said, has tended to be a starting point in determining vulnerability in emergencies, with good reason, but I want to argue this evening that we need to be thinking much more widely than that. This is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, so apologies in advance for that. I really would like to bang the drum for the concept of disaster risk reduction. It's in all the international documents, but it's just something that hasn't really entered our vocabulary in the UK, and I think it should do, because it would make such a difference. So I'm going to bang that drum a bit, if you don't mind. Just, you know, indulge me. I'd also like to just talk about partnership. And we know that integrated emergency management is about working across the piece with a range of agencies, but I think there are a lot of partner agencies out there that don't know they need to work with us yet, and we don't need to work with them. And I'd like to talk about some of those tonight. So that's what I'd like to cover over the next half an hour or so. Is that sufficient to keep you with me rather than going to watch the football or whatever else is on the telly tonight? I'm taking silence as assent. Okay, so this is a quote from somebody. The infinite variety of the human condition defies arbitrary definition. Justice Mumby is the person who said that. And so I guess the point I'm making there is just because people are 75 or 85 years old, it doesn't mean they're vulnerable. In fact, the majority of older people aren't vulnerable. If we think of an 85-year-old man or woman today and think about what they've been through in their life. They were born in 1931, so they've lived through the Second World War. They may have been evacuated. They may have been bombed out. And then they went through a period of austerity after the Second World War, which would put the austerity that we've experienced over the last 5 years to shame with rationing and the like. They've been through life. They've got a lot of experience. Many of them are not vulnerable at all. They're actually very able and capable people. And if they've got the right services and support, they're even less vulnerable. And I guess I'm challenging this assumption that once you get past a certain age, you lose your capabilities and you can't make decisions for yourself or look after yourself, which I think is completely wrong. But we know for a fact that the demographics in England and across the world are changing. The population is greying. The elderly population is expanding. At the moment, we've got 1.5 million people over 85 in England, but this is predicted to more than double over the next 23 years, by which time I'll be nearly 85, to over 3.4 million people. But life isn't over when you hit 85. In fact, most people over that age are rather independent and feel that their health is good and they enjoy a good quality of life. And here are some key factors which I think we all need to take careful note of, which affects vulnerability in later life. First of all, your own attitudes, held by yourself as an individual, and the attitudes of society as a whole. Crucial is contact with family and friends. Social isolation is a really debilitating issue which affects millions of people in this country of all ages, and it has a very debilitating effect. The range and availability of support from others is another factor. Financial resources. If you are sorted financially, you're in a much better position to enjoy the fourth age, as it's sometimes referred to. Suitability of your home and environment, and the extent of support services in your local neighbourhood. So they're key factors affecting vulnerability in later life. And if there's a positive, a positive tick to all of that checklist, then providing that you're in decent health, you've got a good chance of living a good, healthy life. And in terms of emergencies, not being particularly vulnerable. However, I'm not saying for a minute that the focus on old age that emergency planners have traditionally had is wrong. Because people over 75 consistently face more severe impacts as a result of flooding and heat waves. People over 75 were the largest proportion of people who died, excess deaths, in the 2003 heat wave in England. I don't know if you can remember that at all. They can be, and when we're facing flooding, people over the age of 75 are not only susceptible to the immediate dangers of flooding, i.e. drowning, but secondary health impacts such as hypothermia and heart problems. Also, there's this issue around independence and wanting to remain independent as long as possible. And research suggests that there is a tendency amongst older people to be less likely to seek help from the authorities, from social services, because they might be seen as somehow not quite able to cope on their own, and they fear losing their independence, which is of such crucial importance to them. They may be dependent on care from others, either in a residential care home, a nursing home, or just as likely today receiving care and support in their own home. That's been a big shift in our care system over the last few years, with an emphasis on caring for people as close as possible to the home. And also they may live in the types of housing which increases their risks in emergency, i.e. single level, single story apartments or bungalows. So I guess what I'm saying is that we shouldn't make assumptions on the basis of age, but I'm still saying that old age, is not a bad starting point for determining vulnerability. However, there are a range of other ways of looking at vulnerability for primarily for adults, which I just want to run through with you now. And in doing that, I'm indebted to a website entitled Climate Just. I don't know if anyone's come across that at all. Climate Just. One person's nodding. It's Climate Just is short for climate justice. And it's a superb resource, really properly referenced by research, which looks at vulnerability to emergencies, with a particular focus on flooding and heat waves. And it's a really super resource. Would recommend it to you. All you've got to do is just type climate and then separate word just, J-U-S-T, into Google, and it takes you straight there. But not only is it providing analysis of vulnerability in emergencies, it's also providing you with some really interesting suggestions for how to help to diminish vulnerability to the impacts of flooding and heat waves. And it's giving some really superb case studies, so it's absolutely worth looking at. I've got a screenshot of the website a little bit later on in the presentation, but absolutely excellent. And I'm indebted to that particular website for just helping me look beyond age when we're thinking about vulnerability to emergencies. So let's look at some of the other ways of, the other lenses for looking at vulnerability to emergencies. So people with poor health. Here looking at the impact of heat waves on people with poor health. So pre-existing health conditions can increase the risk of dehydration. And I've made a note of some of them here. Or I thought I had. Perhaps I hadn't. But you can work them out. People on medications which affect their renal functions, that's their ability to perspire, their ability to sweat, may be more susceptible to the effects of heat. Those in care homes may suffer because of institutional regimes which can be too rigid. I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever been in a public building in my life where people can actually switch the heating up or down. It's always some eerie figure centrally controlling the heating. Well, in care homes, there may be a sort of institutional mindset which might mean that they're less flexible about looking at getting cooling temperatures. And also, research has suggested that it is in care homes, it is the most independent and least fragile mental health people who are in there who are likely to suffer in a heat wave because the staff perhaps are not fully briefed on the impact of heat waves on elderly people, and are perhaps focusing on those people who seem to be more fragile and more needy. Those who misuse alcohol or take illicit drugs may not be able to adapt quickly, and they may not be well equipped to follow public health advice. I think when we put out public health advice, we've always got to think about who's going to be receiving it and whether they're going to be able to act upon it. And it stands to reason that people who are misusing alcohol or using illicit drugs may not be in a position to safely follow public health advice. And it won't surprise any of us, will it, that homeless people tend to have higher rates of ill health and greater difficulty managing illness. They're also outdoors more. That's the most obvious thing I'm going to say today. So in a heat wave, they're likely to be more exposed. So people with poor health, clearly an additional category. Sticking with people with poor health and now focusing on the impact of flooding. The impact of flooding may restrict their access to critical medicines. People with limiting long-term illnesses may be less able to prepare for and cope, and I think I have made a note of some of those illnesses. So power cuts can impact upon life support equipment, mobility, because people are in electric wheelchairs which need recharging. Lifts that they need to use might be out of action because of power cuts arising from flooding. People with mental health disorders, again, less able to prepare for and respond to the threats posed by flooding. And again, we've got the problem with people who misuse alcohol or take drugs being less able to adapt quickly or follow public health advice. Okay. Also research has suggested that conditions such as dementia or Alzheimer's actually can change how a person views the dangers associated with a flooding event and how they behave in response to it. So, having moved on from age as a determinant, poor health clearly is a key issue we need to look at. But now I want to talk about poverty. People on low incomes, very low income households. In 2006 that was sub £10,000. I'm not quite sure where the figure will be drawn today, are least likely to have home contents insurance. So that's 44% is the figure compared to those on average income. So that's quite a big difference, 44% to 82%. More likely to be tenants, so less control over their property, less likely to be able to make alterations to make the property more able to resist problems with flooding if the area is affected by flooding. They're more likely to be displaced by flooding because they occupy housing which may well be less resilient, and they may have fewer transport options. And I'm just quoting there, transport poverty. I don't know if you've come across transport poverty as an issue. I hadn't heard of it expressed in quite that way. But a charity known as Sustrans, that's Sustrans, they say their view is that there's an increasingly large group of people who suffer transport poverty. And this group are denied access to job opportunities, education, care services, and participation in social, cultural and leisure activities as a result of their reliance on public transport, which can be very limited in some areas. Okay, so there's a focus there on low incomes. We've looked at old age, health, now beginning to look at poverty. Okay, following on from the theme of less well-off people financially, tenants in social, or rented private housing. They tend to be reliant on the landlord for buildings insurance, and is that buildings insurance going to be sufficient? Less likely to have contents insurance. So 60% plus in social and private rented sector lack contents insurance, compared to less than 10% in the owner-occupied field. So that leaves them extremely vulnerable to any emergency, and I'm thinking particularly of severe weather and flooding, which could leave their home inundated. Less likely to have the right to improve their property because they'd need to get the consent of their landlord, which might not be forthcoming. Availability and affordability of insurance is an issue in some areas, although as I'm guessing many people will know, the government has come up with this scheme Flood Re now, whereby they levy a tax on the home insurance industry to create a pot of money. I think it's about 180,000 per annum, which underwrites claims on flood insurance policies. Sorry. Do you want to just say a bit more about that? So are you saying that it's only available to homeowners? When you go on the website, though, I'm not doubting what you say. When you go on the website and click on it, it says for homeowners, which is consistent with what you say. But then when you go into it in a bit more detail, it's talking about tenants as well. Contents insurance. Yes, that's right. So my understanding is that if a tenant makes a claim on his or her, for flood damages on his or her contents insurance, then that will be, and it's a legitimate claim and it's an accepted claim, it will be underwritten by this 180 million fund. Right, so the point you're making there is that there's a distinction there between the buildings insurance and the contents insurance. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd gathered that it's it's still early days with that process. That's central government trying to sort of intervene in a way which makes things less disadvantageous for tenants. Now, social housing tenants, this is where they have a benefit here. They may get much more ready support to relocate because the housing provider will have a duty to house them. But they've got very little control over when and where they go, and also very little control over the standard repairs on their home. And then finally, private renters might struggle to find alternative accommodation at a reasonable price after the flood, because as we all would anticipate, there's the potential there for there to be a shortage, a limited supply of alternative accommodation. And certainly there were tales coming out of Cumbria, and I know you've just done a debrief of the flooding at Cumbria, Hugh, where certainly one estate agent was boosting the cost of renting to take advantage of the of demand outstripping supply. Okay, I mentioned social isolation, and it really is a big factor in vulnerability, I would say. They really do face much more serious harm in emergencies. This is the Paris heatwave, same year as the England one in 2003. Of the 919 people who died at home during that 2003 heatwave, 92% of them lived alone, which I think is very significant. And not having those social support networks means that people aren't helped to respond to and recover from emergencies. And then when you link social isolation with geographical physical isolation, which may well occur when people are living in rural and coastal areas, then that amplifies the problem still further. And of course, you can't look at any of these categories of vulnerability in isolation. Many of them are present, entwined together and reinforce each other. And so social isolation, often associated with other factors such as old age, poor physical, mental health, and poverty. And then people with low personal mobility, generally people who haven't got a car and they are relying on primarily bus services, getting help during emergencies. They're relying on these services which may be disrupted. The infrastructure, the transport infrastructure may be adversely affected, and accessibility to services can vary considerably from one geographical area to another. And almost finally, people living in neighbourhoods without green space, where there isn't that stretch of green, those frequent stretches of green or trees or what have you, that we all pretty well used to in this part of the country. Cities in particular, during heat waves, are prone to, or hot weather, are prone to this urban heat island effect, in that temperatures in the city exceed those in the surrounding rural areas, and particularly increase at night. Also, this is a problem I think we've heard quite a bit about, this surface ceiling in urban areas, where everything's concreted over, including the gardens, which limits drainage capacity for runoff water. And the absence of this green space has wider health and well-being impacts, and can affect community resilience, because if you haven't got the space to exercise, you can't be as healthy. Public spaces, green spaces encourage social interaction, and that can improve cohesion and well-being generally. So the absence of green spaces in a neighbourhood is another factor which can make people more vulnerable in an emergency. And then I think I'm pretty much finally now just onto young children and babies. It's just worth talking about very young children and babies, because they've got greater physical susceptibility to many hazards, including heat stress from hot weather. Heat builds up in younger children. They're not perspiring as quickly. If they've got pre-existing illnesses or disability, they may be particularly susceptible. And extreme events may be both traumatic and they may lead to developmental impacts. And some research, I don't know if you were associated with it, Hugh, after the rain in Hull. This was stories of children affected by the flooding in Hull in 2007, revealing really quite traumatic impacts on their life, on their emotional well-being, impacting on their development, impacting on their school life, and potentially impacting on their life chances. Okay, last category I just wanted to share with you in terms of looking at vulnerability, in this segment of what I'm speaking about, is situations where people have not been in an area for very long, transient communities. And I guess we're all aware of transient communities where there's a high rate of population turnover. And interestingly, that can make people in those transient communities more vulnerable. as compared to areas where the population is stable, because they may not have that sort of local knowledge, that community history, which tells them about the likelihood of events such as flooding, may not have that sort of knowledge of how to respond, where to seek supports. Also, we know that transient communities sometimes associated with inward migration, so there may be language and cultural issues which may get in the way of people being able to look after themselves in an emergency. And if you've got transient communities which are undeveloped with a high turnover of people, then you're likely to have an absence of social networks, which we talked about before as being so important. Some of these people may not feature in official stats. Because one of the things that we look at when we're trying to plan for the needs of vulnerable people in emergency, we look at the census, we look at the voters register, official statistics, and in these transient communities, they may not be an accurate reflection of who we've got. Okay, so with thanks to Climate Just, that's a screenshot of their website, and it's a fantastic resource. So where I've got to at the moment is I've got this piece of feedback saying you're focusing too much on old age. I agree with that feedback, and I've just shared with you some other ways, some other lenses of looking at vulnerability in emergencies. I'll perhaps get some feedback from you when I finish speaking about what you think about those other lenses, how useful they potentially are in identifying vulnerability in an emergency. Right, I'll just take a breath. Okay, at this point, I'd just like to ask, what's happened to community resilience? I was thinking about posting a missing report. Is it me, or has it just disappeared? Because it seems to me, if you look at all of those factors, all of those vulnerability factors, many of them are present, working with each other to make individuals and communities more vulnerable. So you'd think one of the ways that you might sort of address that is by helping to develop and build up communities. Perhaps doing some work in those communities where there's a high turnover of people to try and identify the sort of anchors, the people who've been there a while, who are receiving people and supporting people as they come in, to try and build up the resilience. But I just went on this website today. Do you know it? The Community Resilience Case Study Library. It's on gov.uk. And I remember this being established in 2010, I think it was, or 2009, because you remember that the Pitt report after the summer floods in 2007 said, you know, we've got some real power and strength in our communities. We need to recognise that and help build it up so that we can concentrate our efforts on the people who need our assistance most. Anyway, this Community Resilience Case Study Library is absolutely brilliant, providing you think the world stopped in 2011. There's nothing on there since 2011. It was a really good paper, actually. Community Flood Wardens in Doncaster. I'd recommend it to you. 2011. Anyway, that's the most recent, and that related to something that happened in 2007. So I'm wondering what's happened to it. Another indication that community resilience has gone missing is that one of the courses I deliver for the college is I deliver training to elected members. It's entitled Elected Members, Your Role in Civil Protection. Senior officers in local authorities probably think they haven't got a role at all. And when I go and deliver this training to elected members, I say to them, look, you've got legitimacy. You've been elected. People in the community will take note of what you say, because if you are not being straight with them, they've got the opportunity of turning you out at the next election. Anyway, so when I do my training for elected members, I say, okay, you know your communities best. Some of you have been councillors for your wards for 25 years. What's your role in community resilience? And I've only ever had blank looks. So anyway, perhaps when we get into the conversation bit, then you can perhaps tell me whether where I can find community resilience. Perhaps I've not been looking hard enough. But it seemed to me that you know, if we are saying that vulnerability to the impacts of emergencies is quite a complex issue with a number of factors we need to look at, it seems to me that part of the solution to the problem, or a really promising approach, would be community resilience. But it just seems to me to have gone missing. And as I say, you can tell me I'm wrong there in a few minutes. Okay, I just want to touch upon the international frameworks which help us think about how we're going to manage emergencies. There's a reason for that, and the reason for that is this issue I mentioned at the beginning, that's disaster risk reduction. I love disaster risk reduction, and I would love it to be part of our ethos and thinking in the UK, which I don't think it is at the moment. And again, you can give me your view on that when we sit down and have a chat in a minute. But I'd just like to touch upon the international frameworks. People familiar with the Hyogo, I'll probably pronounce it wrong, Hyogo framework? No? Right. That's okay. You don't need to be anymore because it's finished. But it ran for 10 or 15 years up to 2015, and it was a UN developed framework to try and tackle some key issues relating to reducing vulnerability to disasters. And the one thing it really stressed, which I thought was fantastic, and again, I'd be interested to get your views on this. They said that disaster risk reduction, reducing the risk from emergencies, should be part of the school curriculum. Now, I think that is a brilliant idea because it's educating young people, the decision makers, the emergency planners, the Category 1 responders, the volunteers, the community leaders or whatever of tomorrow about the challenges of preparing for emergencies and reducing vulnerability. There's also loads of knock-on brilliant effects, like it's giving you some insight into getting involved in your community, you know, being an active citizen, showing leadership. So I think it's absolutely fantastic. Now, for my pains, I have read the UK updates to Hyogo, which were produced every 3 years, and I have to tell you, they were rubbish. This is what they said. This is what they said about the idea that emergency management, disaster risk reduction, should be part of the school curriculum. The closest the author, or authors, presumably a civil servant from the Cabinet Office, got to saying that it might be a good idea to incorporate disaster risk reduction into the school curriculum in the UK was an acknowledgement that teachers might cover some of the issues in assemblies, especially perhaps if an emergency were a serious possibility. So that's as far as the UK government got. If there's just the possibility of an emergency, we might just talk about it in assembly. And that was it. That was as far as they got. Every 3 years or so, they'd provide a detailed update against these Hyogo framework for action, and that's as far as they got. But having said that, the author, on behalf of the Cabinet Office, seemed to be assuming that we got at one big homogenous education system in the UK, which we all know we haven't. The education system is completely different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and subtly different in Wales. And the author of these updates to Hyogo had failed to notice that Scotland, hooray for Scotland here, they've implemented disaster risk reduction in the school curriculum. Hooray! They've got a range of resources. They've got a superb website with a range of resources, really well worth looking at, which assists teachers in putting community resilience and emergency risk reduction onto the curriculum for children in Scotland. And that's a really fantastic thing. But obviously the person who was preparing these updates hadn't noticed that. Anyway, I read all these updates, and I'm over it now. And Hyogo has gone, so it doesn't matter if you don't know anything about it, because we've now got the CI framework, 2015-2030, right? So this is now the international overarching approach to disaster risk reduction, and presumably the same person in the Cabinet Office will be getting the quill pen out ready to update against these 7 global targets. I'll just briefly go through them there. You can read them just as well as I can. But as you'll see, these are the first 4 of the 7. First one's looking at mortality, deaths from disasters. Okay, aiming for quite a significant reduction there, which will be difficult to achieve because all of the estimates suggest that the impacts of climate change will result in significant increase in harm, deaths, particularly amongst vulnerable people across the planet over the next 10, 20 years. Second one is about reducing the number of affected people, people affected by disasters. Third one, as you can see, is economic loss. Fourth one relates to critical infrastructure, basic services, including health and education. 3 more to go. No. Educational facilities you're talking about. Yeah. But you're talking about the PFI, Private Finance Initiative there. 5, 6, and 7 then. Increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. I'd like to increase it by 1, the UK. And I'll tell you why. I'll disclose to you why I'm such a big fan of disaster risk reduction. And I'd like you to go forward from this place and take disaster risk reduction back to your communities and prepare for government, or whatever it was, I can't remember now. Number 6, international cooperation to complement national plans. So that's international cooperation to assist developing countries, which is a very good aspiration. And then the 7th one is around early warning systems. Okay, so they're the 7 goals. And so those are the 7 goals that a multitude of countries, from the richest countries like ourselves through to the poorest, will be working on over the next 15 years. And there are 4 priorities. These are they. Understanding risk, which is what we've been talking about really this evening. Oh my God, it's 8:45. Just a minute. I'm just getting carried away here. Strengthening governance, investing in disaster risk reduction, and enhancing disaster preparedness. And when disaster has struck, looking to build back better, as they did in Manchester in the years following the IRA bomb in 1996. Okay, I'm going to speed on now because I wanted to allow some time for conversation. Oops. Go back. Yeah, and this is disaster risk reduction. And the reason I love this, the reason I'm enraptured by disaster risk reduction, is when you look at the definition here from Twig. I'll let you read it. The thing I think we do well in the UK is the second bit of that first bullet point, dealing with the environmental and other hazards that trigger disasters. I think we're very good at anticipating risks and hazards, working up plans to try and prevent them and mitigate them. I think we're really good at that. I don't think there can't be many countries on the planet that's better at it. But we're not so good at looking at reducing the social, economic, environmental vulnerabilities of our communities to disaster, which is what I guess I've been on about earlier on when I was talking about vulnerable adults. And I really would like us to take disaster risk reduction on. It's a key concept in all those international documents I was talking about, IOGO and Sendai, but it's just never really entered our thinking and vocabulary. Anyway, I'm just going to skim through some partners you didn't know you had. Anyone familiar with Ofgem? This is they. They're the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, and they're the regulators for the companies which send us these ridiculously huge electricity and gas bills, and also the companies which distribute electricity and gas. So they've been asleep on the job for the last few years whilst they've been ripping us poor consumers off. But did you know, has anyone in this room been consulted by Ofgem on their attempt to get the electricity and gas suppliers to take their responsibilities to provide sign-up for vulnerable people to priority services in the event of an interruption of power supply? Were you aware that they've been consulting on that? I didn't know that electricity was really pushing it. I didn't really know what it was coming from Ofgem. Right. Okay. Well, it's interesting. We're not that much consultation here in this room, but they've got the power over those companies, and this is what their concerns were. They are saying that these energy supply and distribution network operators have got an overarching responsibility to protect vulnerable customers, and it's a condition of their license they maintain this register to put customers from these eligible groups on the register when they request it. And those are the eligible groups currently. People of pensionable age. Well, that's not a very good indicator, is it? So that's people aged, I don't know, my wife's just been through this situation where she thought she was getting a pension at 60. Now she's got to wait till she's 67. She's not happy about it at all. So 67, say, disabled, chronically sick, and those with visual or hearing problems. Ofgem have got some concerns, and these are they. First of all, that most people who are eligible in those four categories don't actually register. So of the people who have dialysis at home, only 37% of the people who've got dialysis at home are registered for priority electricity supply in the event of a power cut. Now, the health guidance, if you have, I don't know if you or a member of your family has had dialysis at home, you can go without it for a day, but after that, you're really struggling. So, you know, it's really worrying if there's a power cut, but only 37% are registered. Limited awareness of the opportunity to register, only 24% of consumers are aware of it. The companies are not very good at sharing data about vulnerable customers with each other, and given that people can switch from one supplier to another, that's a bad thing. And there's the potential for poor outcomes. So they're the concerns. These are their proposals, which they've recently consulted on, and they're now going to reach a decision on. I don't know how long that will take, perhaps a few months. They're going to make it the responsibility of the suppliers to identify the customers who need these services. So that presents an opportunity for us, because our partners in the utilities have got to become much more proactive at identifying. Not waiting for people to contact them, but they've got to be proactive. They're going to have a broad eligibility requirement based on customer need, and they're going to be adding families with children under the age of 5. And again, there's an emphasis there on our third bullet point on being much more proactive in terms of making customers aware. So there's a real opportunity, because I don't think the electricity and gas companies can do this without us. And if they get more people signed up, then they are taking more responsibility, and the risks involved are being shared. Not shifted, shared. These are further proposals that the energy companies work with citizens' advice and other third-party advisors, which might be us, I guess, to develop customer advice and information materials. And this last point is the threat, is the veiled threat. They're going to be monitoring them more closely. They have got enforcement powers which they've not used. So they're a partner for us, Ofgem, because they want to achieve the same things that we want to achieve. Other potential partners, United Kingdom Home Care Association, everyone familiar with them? No, I didn't think so. I wasn't until quite recently. But they're the organisation which bring together all of the private sector companies which provide domiciliary care in people's home. When they're going in 3 or 4 times a day, providing with personal care, helping them with feeding, bathing and what have you. Now they could be allies of ours in terms of helping people prepare for emergencies. And they want to help. I've been in touch with them, they want to help, but they've got other things which they think are more important, like the national living wage for one, which will make some of their organisations unviable. Another one here, National Housing Federation, the voice of housing associations, again, who could play a really big role with us. So I'm just going to finish really by saying there are some partners that we could work with nationally and potentially locally as well. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone over my 40 minutes. Very happy now to take questions. What I normally do when I take questions is rather than just drop it on you, do you want to just have a quick chat for